All right. Um, it's my pleasure to introduce Chris DuSell, who's been a member since 2010 of the Zen Center. And in that role, she has played many wonderful key volunteer spots, steward of the study circle, of the women's circle, and now of the ethics circle, looking at that again. She has been in human resources, I know, for a long time. She has an MSW, Masters of Social Work, and in human resources for 25 years. She's also been on our board of directors and is a fully empowered Zen life instructor. So with that, Chris, wise speech.
Thank you. Yes, and I will just add that I was in human resources for that, and I am blissfully retired. I'm enjoying retirement very, very much for the last, I guess, 3 years now it's been, doing a lot of different things. But boy, it's really wonderful. It's too bad it takes us so long to get here. And saying that from somebody who, like, I fully enjoyed my career. I loved work, absolutely loved it. So it's not like I was counting the days, but even still, I'm really enjoying the difference in sort of the space that's available in my life. So welcome, happy to see all of you this morning. About, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 weeks ago, I gave a talk, and I gave a talk on compassion. And you're not hearing me, Shuping? Are you? Oh, you are hearing me. Okay. And when I started that talk, I remember saying that, how did I ever choose a topic like compassion? It's so huge. It's like too big for a Sunday morning Zen talk. So for today's talk, I decided to really narrow it in. And I'm going to talk about right speech, wise speech, virtuous speech. As I was developing the talk, I realized that there are many elements of it that sound very much like my compassion talk, which makes sense because when we're talking about wise speech, when we're talking about virtuous speech, we're talking about coming from a more loving place, a more compassionate place than maybe sometimes we do. So I want to first just do a little background before talking about right speech, and say a little bit about meditation and how that connects with right speech. So meditation is our primary practice, right? And it's good and it's necessary. It requires some discipline, some effort on our parts. We're not accustomed to simply sitting. As June said, yeah, Liz.
Sorry, we're getting a little bit of feedback. I'm not sure if anybody else is hearing it on this end. There's some feedback coming back in, a lot of static every once in a while.
I get that too. Thank you.
Okay. It kind of goes in and out. It's weird.
Chris, you might try using a standing mic, one of those. It might be the batteries in the microphone are going. Yeah.
Okay, we'll try that. Can you hear me? Move it closer.
It just won't stay up, will it?
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Much clearer, thank you.
Great, okay. Thanks for stopping me, Liz. So I was talking about meditation, saying that it's our primary practice and that it requires some discipline, even after having been a member here at the Zen Center since, as June said, 2010, so 13 years, it still requires a little effort on my part. I can definitely, I could easily slide into not doing meditation on a regular basis. It's always easy to say that there's something else I should do, or that I've got too much in my day, and too much in my schedule, so not to do it. What about being productive? You know, I've got to get going. But if we stick to it and we apply some gentle discipline and develop a sitting practice, we begin to find that over time, it gives us some steadiness, some sturdiness to our day-to-day activities. We find we're a little less hijacked by our emotions. We find we're able to pause in our day-to-day life in situations and decide what the best course of action is. And we find that we can tolerate uncertainty a little bit better in our lives. Not knowing becomes a little bit more of our friend. So in the continuing surge of interest in mindfulness in our whole culture, oops, sorry about that, a lot of attention is put on mindfulness and on meditation. And in the spiritual path of Zen, mindfulness meditation is really fundamental, but it's not all. Think about it. If you took this mindfulness meditation to its extreme, an assassin would benefit from pure mindfulness meditation, right? They would enhance their capacity for being steady in the face of high stress, being able to stay focused on the dot with what has to be done. So that's why it's so important for all of us to appreciate the fullness of our practice, the fullness of the spiritual path. Our meditation practice for sure is important, and our off-the-cushion practices to cultivate wholesome thoughts, speech, and actions, to do harm and to do good, are just as important. Another word that's often used for these skillful thoughts, speech, and actions are upayas, right? That's kind of what we're talking about. The Zen spiritual path is about reducing suffering for ourselves and others. And there is a whole array of practices that support us in our spiritual path. What do we do when we get off the cushion, so to speak, or off your chair, or wherever you do this? What do we do? How do we go into our day? What kind of heart and mind do we bring to the rest of our day? How often during the day do you check in with your mind to see where it's at? All of these things are equally important to our meditation, in my humble opinion. Are you bringing your intentions to do good and not to harm to your daily actions and interactions? You know, I think this is what distinguishes a pure mindfulness meditation practice from a spiritual practice. And we need to have both. We are not simply practicing to become more calm ourselves, to handle stress better, to reduce our sense of overwhelm. These things are fine, they're good, nothing wrong with them. But on a spiritual path, we have aspirations to reduce suffering for ourselves and for others. I found this quote that I've never read before. I thought it was great. It's by Theodore Roosevelt. He says, "If you could kick the person in the pants most responsible for your trouble, you wouldn't sit for a month." I love that. This means that off the cushion, we have to pay attention to our thoughts, our words, and our actions, because it's our thoughts, words, and actions that create suffering for ourselves and for others. So today I'm going to focus on the off the cushion. You know, what are one of the practices that we want to pay attention to in our day-to-day lives that is related to our meditation, but it's extended beyond our meditation. And right speech, wise speech, virtuous speech. Thich Nhat Hanh calls it loving speech. Makes so much sense that he would say that. That's sort of where he comes from, and I love that way of thinking about it. It's generally talked about in concert with right thought and right actions. But in my attempt to really narrow down this time, I went with just right speech. It's a bit hard to tease out because they're so related, right thought, speech, and actions. But I'm going to give it a go, and I think most of what I say will apply to those, all three of those things. So sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. We've all heard that, right? BS, right? I'm calling BS, as they say. That's just ridiculous. I mean, I found something from a Jewish writing, which I think is much more accurate. It says, the blow of a whip raises a welt, but a blow of the tongue crushes the bones. It seems like it's a little more appropriate. You know, it called to mind for me, all of us probably have these seminal memories from when we were kids. And I have one of being in the 4th grade, and I was in line to get lunch at the cafeteria, and my 3rd grade teacher, who I revered, Mrs. Robertson, came up to me and said that she had found out that I had gotten a C in some class, in some study in 4th grade, and how disappointed she was in me. I am 65 years old, y'all, and I still remember what that felt like. Now, some might say that that was a really great thing for her to say, because trust me, for the rest of my education, through my graduate degree, I never got a C again, you know, right? But on the other hand, what it left me with was shame. I disappointed somebody who I revered, and it led to more perfectionism in my life. You know, thinking that I had to be perfect in order for people not to be disappointed with me. I am sure all of you listening to me right now have a similar story of something that's happened to you if you thought about it. So words are really important. It also reminds me of one of the 4 preliminaries from Norman Fisher's Training in Compassion book, where he says the awesome and indelible power of our actions, to which I would add the awesome and indelible power of our words, our speech. We often do not appreciate what our words, whether they are nurturing, nourishing, supportive words, or they're harsh, sarcastic, or lies or gossip words. The indelible power of those words, we really need to take into consideration. So right speech is referenced in the precepts, and Buddha was pretty precise in his description of right speech. Abstinence from false speech, not lying. Abstinence from malicious speech, not using speech to create discord. Abstinence from harsh speech, not using a cynical, hostile, or raised tone of voice. Abstinence from idle chatter, not engaging in gossip. Or we can flip these and make them more positive. Saying only what is true, speaking in ways that promote harmony, using a tone of voice that is kind and gentle, and speaking mindfully in order that our speech is useful and purposeful. It's important to state here that these aren't moralistic trainings. They certainly prescribe moral conduct or ethical conduct for sure, but they're not intended to be an evaluative measure to determine whether you're a good or bad person, right? That's not what this is about. In this context, right speech or right or wise speech is not a moral judgment to be contrasted with right and wrong, but rather a means leading to happiness for self and others. Thich Nhat Hanh says that right speech is a Buddhist term for loving speech, or speech that is nourishing, peaceful, compassionate, and understanding. In contrast to wrong speech, the kind of speech that lacks openness and does not have understanding, compassion, and reconciliation at its base. So the Dharma provides these trainings and guides to help us cultivate speech that does not create harm, and speech that appreciates the essential relational quality of our lives and those of others. Staying in relationship is key to our well-being, and not just ours, but everybody else's too. I meant to look this up between sitting and right now, and I forgot to on my phone, but there was a new study out by a Harvard researcher, Robert Waldinger, or I can't remember his last name, but it's actually in a book as well. But it's a longitudinal study that they did with a lot of people. And one of the key components of living a life of satisfaction and joy is relationships, is having at least one, if not more, relationships in our lives in which we feel connected, engaged, safe. So we're social animals, we know that, and it's becoming even more clear in a lot of the studies that are coming out that that is a key component to our sense of well-being, is being in relationship, being in community. And I have said more than once here in different venues that before I got to the Zen Center, before I started coming here, I didn't realize that what was missing in my life was a sense of community. How important it was to my own day-to-day satisfaction, and why this place is so important to me is because of that. And our speech and our words can either enhance our sense of connectedness with others, or they can function to separate us, erect barriers and obstacles to appreciating and understanding each other. Okay, so we got it, right speech, be nice, don't yell at each other, stay connected. Easy, right? I always love to tell on myself when I give these talks. So let me give you the tale of two conversations. So my husband and I were going to get together with my sister and brother-in-law for dinner recently. And I came home from being at a meeting, a Zen Center meeting, by the way. I'd had a busy week. I still had tons to do. My husband, Ron, had prepped 70% of the dinner, at least 70%, if not 80%. But some of it, he had not done to my liking. That ego. So I made a few snarky comments, like, wow, that sauce is really well seasoned, meaning over-seasoned. And, oh, those are the dishes you're going to use? I'm sure there were one or two other comments that resulted in a short, heated exchange. Not to worry, we've been married 30 years, we know how to navigate these. And in that very moment, when I was discharging my energy that I had carried into the house, it felt pretty good, get rid of that energy, that tenseness that I already had in my, but pretty quickly I was regretting my words, which is an improvement. It used to take me a little bit longer to recognize my part in a situation. I could feel in my body that my actions hadn't aligned with my intentions, with the way I want to live. And it wasn't just that I felt badly about my words creating dissonance between my husband and I. And I did, but it was that the exchange actually lodged in my body in a way that was unpleasant. My unskillful speech resulted in suffering, both for my husband, myself, and for us together. And as I say, we made it through it. We've been through this before, but how many of us have had these kinds of interactions with ones we love, whether it be partners, parents, siblings, friends, children? We don't intend for it. We don't intend for it, but it happens. So this is a good point to pause and say a word or two about reactivity, which is what happens when we get hooked or activated by some situation. It is especially challenging to practice skillful speech when we're activated by something, when we're carrying anxiety or anxiousness in our body. And when I use the word anxiety or anxiousness, I'm not talking about like being anxious about, will I slip and fall out on the road, the sidewalk today? I'm talking just about an activated, agitated state that we carry. And it can happen when there is a situation in front of us that creates that. But we can also sort of go through our days with just sort of a low-level hum or buzz where we're carrying a lot of energy and anxiety in our bodies. Some of us are mainly calm in our lives with only spikes of this kind of activation in certain situations. And others of us, as I've said, maintain this low-level buzz in our bodies all the time. And when we're in this energetic state, access to our executive functioning, the prefrontal cortex, the skills that help us pause, consider our points of view, be open, that's all less accessible to us because we're being motivated more by our more primitive, our amygdala brain, our survival brain, our threat brain. So it's really important to know what this activity buzz feels like in our bodies. We need to take extra care, with our speech in these times. So meditation can help us learn to pay more attention to these states of our body. What does it feel like in my body when I'm kind of on edge? And how can I be more careful in those times with my speech? These reactive thoughts, emotions, and sensations happen to all of us. So you just want to be aware of how that feels in your body, and so that you can pay attention, pause, be mindful. Being more aware of reactivity enables us to know ourselves better, to create a little space in which to decide what we want to do or say, and thus more consciously choose our behavior. So, tale number 2. I said there were going to be 2. And yes, it's about me and my husband again. Because what better place for this kind of speech than in relationships, close relationships. So Ron and I were having a conversation about a particular vacation that we went on. We're thinking about a next vacation, and we were reviewing some of our past. And we disagreed on whether we had taken a particular day trip to a particular spot in this past vacation. I said, we did go this place. He said, no, we didn't. And I could feel that activation that I'm talking about. I could feel it in my body. I could feel sort of the sense of, I'm right, he's wrong. I wanted to be right. I wanted to make my point. But I felt it this time. And I paused. And I said to myself, how important is this? How important is this that I be right? And I let it go. There's a lot of mindfulness in the moment that was required to pause mentally, noticing my body. And this is where our meditation practice plays out in our off the cushion time. So I let it go. We went on with the conversation. It took us in a different place. And I was so pleased with myself that I had to be very careful not to be too self-congratulatory, because the next time I may not have that same ability to be that mindful. But in that moment, what I like to think is that I privileged cultivating my connection, staying in connection with my husband rather than being right. Because in the end, that's what's more important to me. And of course, there are some topics or issues for which we must stand our ground. I am not saying become a doormat. I am not saying just accept what anybody says. There are absolutely situations where we need to stand our ground, to set boundaries. Even then, we can probably do it more kindly than we often do. But there are many situations in which we can take a pause and decide whether or not this is a time where we really need to make a point. So a few other things about wise speech. Wise speech, as I've already said, is connected to our thinking and our thoughts. Just want to check the time. If I'm not speaking words, angry words, but I'm holding them in my mind and heart, so let's say my thoughts are filled with angry words, but I'm not speaking them, at least that's the first step, right? I'm not polluting the space between us with harsh words. But I want to read a little something from Shantideva. I'm sure some of you have heard of him. He was a 7th to 8th century Buddhist monk, philosopher, and poet. And he has this section out of a long, piece that he had written. And he says, when the urge arises in the mind to feelings of desire or wrathful hate, do not act, be silent, do not speak, and like a log you should remain. When the mind is wild with mockery and filled with pride and haughty arrogance, and when you want to show the hidden fault of others, to bring up old dissensions or to act deceitfully, and when you want to fish for praise or criticize and spoil another's name, or use harsh language sparring for a fight, it's then like a log you should remain. And when you want to do another down and cultivate advantage for yourself, and when the wish to gossip comes to you, it's then like a log you should remain. Impatience, indolence, faint-heartedness, and likewise prideful speech and insolence, attachment to your side, when these arise, it is then like a log you should remain. Examine thus yourself from every side. Note harmful thoughts and every futile striving. Thus it is that heroes in the spiritual path apply the remedies to keep a steady mind with perfect and unyielding faith, with steadfastness, respect, and courtesy, with modesty and conscientiousness, work calmly for the happiness of others. So that phrase, and like a log you should remain, is in my head now. I heard this years ago, and it's just something that comes up for me. It's like, there are many times when I should just be quiet, maybe not say what's in my head. So, as I said, if you have angry words, but you're not saying them, but you're holding them in your mind and heart, that's great. But what we want to do is not feed our thoughts with rumination. We want to not repeat our stories over and over in our head that strengthen whatever those thoughts of conflict or dissension or gossip are. That's pretty much the same as speaking them. They're causing me suffering and likely affecting my behavior in ways that I'm causing suffering. So wise speech requires mindfulness of our thinking. Do you know where your mind is at? A practice that we can take with us throughout the day. Listening is a practice that falls under wise speech. Deep listening is at the foundation of this practice. If we cannot listen mindfully, we can't practice right speech. Because no matter what we say, it will not be mindful. Because we'll be speaking only our own ideas and not response to the other person. When compassionate listening brings about healing, and when someone listens to us in this way, we feel some relief right away. Keeping your word with others and with yourself is part of right speech. Let's say you've said you're sorry to someone for the way that you communicated, angrily, sarcastically, or maybe you withdrew, you gave someone the silent treatment, or maybe you apologized for telling a little white lie. You recognized it, you apologized, or maybe you just noticed it internally and set an intention to do better the next time, to not practice that way. So the next time something comes up, really, really see if you can do better. You know, we give ourselves excuses sometimes to say, you know, that's just kind of how I am. No beating yourself up. Just try to notice earlier and earlier in the process of when you're about to be angry. So if you say something sarcastic, just notice it and then set an intention for yourself to do a little bit better next time. Just like with meditation, we come back to the breath over and over, right? Our mind wanders, we bring it back to the breath. Our mind wanders, we bring it back to the breath. It's the same kind of practice with right speech. We're not going to get it right the first time. It's a practice. And some of us come from families where maybe wise speech wasn't exactly the kind of speech that was regularly practiced. And if that's the case, we need to be really aware of that. And if we need to do some additional work to take that under consideration. So as I'm saying, we're not perfect. This is a practice. It takes discipline to be kind with our words, really kind from your heart, not just performative kindness, right? And by that, I mean, not just the, how you doing to the grocery clerk, where we say it without really having any real thought behind it. It takes some more effort to really ask with the intention of listening. It takes practice to notice your mind, where it's at on a moment-to-moment basis, which is what our meditation practice helps us with. It takes practice to notice your somatic responses to communication. It takes practice to pause, especially when you're right and the other person is wrong. But here are two rubrics I like to use. Does it need to be said? Does it need to be said right now? Does it need to be said by me? So that's one. And the second I like to ask myself, is it true? Is it kind? Is it necessary? And those can help guide me. Before I close with some beautiful words from Thich Nhat Hanh, let me briefly mention two other aspects of wise speech. One is appreciating silence. Wise speech involves silence sometimes too. So we can appreciate that there is not always words that need to be said. We do not always have to share our opinion. We do not always have to jump in. And also that when we're with other people, that sometimes silence rather than idle chatter is actually quite pleasant. And then the second one I wanted to mention is bringing joy through speech. We have so much opportunity through our day to bring joy through speech by noticing things in our life and asking people how they really are, or noticing, at one of the first places I worked, we had a phrase that was really embedded throughout the culture, and it was notice people doing something right. In our environment so much, we're so focused on what's wrong that we don't always pay attention when people are doing something right and notice that out loud to them. So bringing joy to others through our speech. So I'll leave you with this from Thich Nhat Hanh. It's from his book, The Art of Communication. He starts from the premise that no communication is ever neutral. Every communication we put out into the world and every communication we take in from others has the potential to nourish, ease suffering, and create peace, or to poison, increase suffering, and create violence. This includes not just our words, he says, but our body language, our nonverbal sounds,
our facial expressions, and so on. Even the energy generated by our thoughts and emotions that is available to be available to be absorbed and interpreted by others. He says our communication is what we put out into the world and what remains after we have left it. This is a quote. He says, everything we do and say bears our signature. Our communications will not be lost when our physical bodies are no longer here. The effect of our thinking, speech, and physical actions will continue to ripple outward into the cosmos. So that's what I have today. And if anybody wants to share any of their stories about wise speech or has comments, yeah, Liz.
Thank you so much for that. That is such a wonderful Dharma talk. That really is. I loved it. That was so great. I really took notice to what you were saying about the part about where sometimes people are like, oh, that's just how they are. That's just them being honest when they're really being harmful with their words. And it's like, yeah, no, they're not being honest. They're being a jerk. You know? So I love that talk. I really did. You did such a bang up job with it. I truly loved it. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Liz. Annie. Oh,
Hi. Hi,
Annie
hi.
from Penzance.
The end of the world.
Yes.
Oh, thank you so much, Chris. This is wonderful to hear you. And I was looking forward to this all morning. I know you have a change of time there too. So I'm glad I made it right. Yeah, your speech just touched on so many aspects of actually communion, like communication, communion with other people, with others. And this Sangha has provided me with so much connection. You know, when I tune in, I feel like, oh, my buddies are here. I'm connected to people in a way that's so special. And I would also like to say that in thinking about right speech, it's really difficult now to try and formulate or develop a language that's not coercive or damning or critical concerning the environmental crisis and concerning restorative justice and gender equality. And it's like a huge kind of challenge that I feel we are facing now to address these issues, because it starts on a cellular level, like with us, between us, and then on a global level with all the challenges we face. And I'll tell a story. I went away at Christmas time and my roommate has 2 cats. And when I came back and the cats were in my room, the door was open and I was looking through my closet and I saw my favorite coat had a shred in it. And I wasn't sure it was from a moth or from a cat nail. So I showed it to my roommate and I said, I'm not sure yet what this is. I'm going to find out. And she got really offended because I inferred it might have been the cats. So she screamed at me and I was like shaking inside. And I just thought, I didn't say anything. I just said, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend. I just thought it's possible it might happen. And I let it go at that. 3 months later, I go to a repair cafe over at the local gallery and I asked the seamstress, what do you think this was? And she said, this is a cat tear. You know, this is something from a cat. It's not a moth hole. And I just said, okay. I didn't say anything to my roommate, but I'm holding inside myself a little bit of pride, and I'm not sure that's too cool, but it does feel good once in a while. So just thank you so much for everything, and I'll stop now.
Thanks, Annie. Yeah, Diane, let me give you the.
Just a short comment. I really, this was perfect. You did a great job. This was very, very helpful. I think it's like meditation is one thing, but when you actualize it, then it's all of this. So if it's inside us, that's great, and we go better, but the communications are really the essence of sort of living this. And you've just given me a lot to think about. So thank you. Do you want to?
Thank you. Excellent talk. I very much appreciated it. You mentioned early on, and I'm not sure how it directly connects to speech or right speech, but developing a not knowing mind. When I first started a Buddhist practice over 20 years ago, somehow I came across that somewhere, and I'm not sure, but it always stuck with me because I tend to consume a lot of information, and especially a lot of news. And I've slowly gotten to the point where of thinking, do I really need to read this story? Which leads to, do I really need to make this comment, which you alluded to later? So thanks for bringing that up.
Thank you. Yeah, not knowing mind is a really powerful practice for sure. We're not always right, even when we think we are. So if there are no other comments oh, Robin, go ahead, please.
I just, thanks a lot, Chris. There was so much of value in your talk and all the reminders and everything. And one of the things I really love about Buddhism that you underscored is that we think about behavior as skillful or not skillful, not necessarily like bad or wrong. And that feels so good to me. And I love the idea of thinking that we can increase our skills through practice, that we're engaged in a practice. So thank you so much for reminding us.
Thanks, Robin. Robert.
Chris, I really enjoyed your talk. It's so practical and such a important practice for all of us, huh? And learning, I like the way you talked about knowing when to say something and when not to, and who's to say it. And I also kind of am interested in what Annie just said about, the times we are living in are very divided. I mean, we are so divided as a country. I don't know how it is in England, but it makes it hard to have even conversations. So I think at the time when we had a neighbor, when we were in the house on Humphrey Street, that didn't like us and was turning us into the authorities and taking photographs of the Zen Center. And every time I try to practice nonviolent communication with her over the fence, I'd be talking to her back, walking away from me. So it's not always, how do you practice right speech with someone that doesn't want to have the conversation? I guess silence is the practice then, but it still begs the question: how do we practice right speech in an environment where there's so much toxic speech there's so much toxicity in the speech that's being practiced? And the thing that I think of is again Shanti Deva's, who's full of lots of wisdom. He said something like, don't don't demonize the person, criticize their action, so you're not personalizing it so much. But I think it's a real challenge right now, how to practice right speech in the social and political environment. I'd like to hear if anyone else has some wisdom on the subject, because it befuddles me a little bit.
Anyone want to take that up? I mean, I totally agree with what both Annie and Robert are saying. And when I was doing this talk, I thought about that, that it was very individual what I was talking about. You know, it didn't go up to the political. And I just kept coming back to, this is my sphere of influence.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is my sphere of influence. What can, you know, how can I practice more skillfully myself? But it is hard, I agree.
I have a friend, a good friend, that I have been on ski trips with, and we shared accommodations, and but he and I are on diametrically opposite ends of the political poles. And on one trip, we actually had, you know, a big argument about who was right, or who, you know, and how could somebody, you know, believe what that person, you know, believes. And since then, I've learned to focus on what we have in common. And I've focused on trying to be a good friend rather than talk about these, you know, the subject of one's political, you know, leaning. So that hardly ever, or when it, you know, kind of begins to pop up in my mind, I just avoid it. And we'll try and focus on something else. Some, you know, like, hey, do you want to get together and have breakfast or something? And we'll just talk about old times and not. So that's how I have gotten by along in that relationship, and I'm satisfied with it. I feel good about it.
Thanks, Harold. Ken?
One of the areas that I've sort of been thinking about in terms of speech that I don't know if anyone else has felt the same way, but the pace of speech. A friend of mine shared with me the study that showed that in modern American society, in any given conversation, the amount of time in between the two people speaking is negative. Okay. That we are literally not even waiting for the other person to finish before we reply. And I've become more mindful of that and realizing, and Roshi Robert was going to call me Martin again, I think, because I'm always quoting Martin Buber. But the idea there is that silence in between the two people speaking is what Buber calls the sacred. And I think in Indian spirituality, it's the silent syllable of the Aum, but different cultures speak about it differently. And I've tried to make more room for the sacred.
That's really wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. I really love that.
Maybe this fits and maybe it doesn't, but a friend of mine is a college student and she has a lot of her lessons are videotaped that she needs to listen to. And so she listens to them on fast speed, which I just think somehow relates. It's like time and a half. So then she gets through them faster. It's like, oh, okay. Oh.
Yeah, great comments about this. You know, the one thing I I'm not good at doing this myself, but I know that I'm thinking about nonviolent communication. Marshall, what's his last name? Rosenberg. Okay.
Rosenberg.
I remember when I read his book years and years ago, he talked about when he would be in hot situations with people who were really sort of screaming, and this was in political situations, he would always try to go a level up to find what the commonality, where you could find commonality with someone else. Because he said this was, I think, in the Middle East, the example was, and at some point, everybody wants safety. So even if you're coming at it from different directions, if you can pull the conversation up and start with agreements around that. And again, I'm saying, I'm not great at doing that. I'm not even great at remembering that, but it does make me want to go back and read about that a little bit more again. Yeah, Robert.
Yeah, that's a wonderful thing about Marshall. I had the good fortune to study with him, and I watched him. I was around him during 9/11 when we were doing a training, and he was on a radio show where he was being attacked. And I watched him slow the conversation down. He just slowed everything down. He doesn't interrupt, and he would listen. And then there'd be a significant pause between his response and what someone had just said. And I think the key here that you were just alluding to is this needs awareness that NVC uses a lot to sort of step underneath where we're thinking about being right and wrong, and seeing our common, as someone just said here, seeing our common, as Eric just said, finding our common ground. And usually we may have the same needs like safety, but we have different strategies for meeting the need. And if you actually approach a conflict from that place, then you might actually have a rational conversation instead of demonizing each other, which could be interesting. I think conflict is actually important, and we shouldn't shy away from it, but we tend to be very scared of conflict as being awful, but it could be an opportunity for transformation and learning and growth if we were just a little bit more confident that we could be in disagreement with each other and not, blow the world up.
Yeah, and often be in disagreement with each other, but not break the connection. Right?
Yeah.
There's that relational piece again.
Yes.
Yeah. So.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, everybody. This was fun to do and great conversation. I appreciate all your comments, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, Annie.
Chris.
Bye.
Thank you, Chris.